Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am bringing you my March wrap-up. So March, huh? What a weird month that was. I can't believe how different the 1st of March has been from the 1st of April. Like, it's just madness. And not to pile on with the whole pandemic and all of that, but like, it's been weird. Real weird. Fortunately, I've been able to do quite a lot of reading, and I've been able to keep up with the kind of standard pace of reading that I usually do. I read 11 books in the month of March. The sort of types of books that I've been able to read have been a little bit different. I have been picking stuff up, putting it down. It's been a strange time. This has nothing to do with quarantine brain, but I did DNF a couple of books, and I will talk about those first, and then I will go into the books that I read in the month of March. For the most part, they are, as per usual, sci-fi and fantasy, although we do have a sneaky kind of women's fiction book that made its way in here. For better or for worse, you can decide. But yeah, it was a really good month for reading. I had a couple of amazing things that I read. Some really great stuff, some potential favorites for the year, and I also had some stuff that didn't quite live up to my expectations, so let's get started. So I decided to DNF 2 books this month because of various reasons. They're quite different books. One is a dystopian book and the other is a fantasy book, and for whatever reason I couldn't quite get there with them. So the very first one is Kingdom of Liars by Nick Martell. Unfortunately, this is a debut novel. It just wasn't really working with my brain. I will give it another try, probably at another point, maybe when I have the kind of headspace for a slower book that takes a while to develop. The problem is that this is a very long book. This is what, like, almost 600 pages, and I have heard on good authority from other people who have read it, people whose opinions I really trust, that it dramatically improves in the second half because the main character is sort of telling his story and has to flash back to when he's much younger, very arrogant, very selfish, and just not a particularly likable person. So that's the part that I was stuck at. I made it about 135 pages into this book, which I think is a very fair chance, but it just didn't end up working for me. I couldn't connect with the character, Michael, and I wasn't hugely drawn into the world, unfortunately, which is such a shame because it sounded like such an amazing book. It follows a man named Michael Kingman who is, at the very beginning, standing trial for murdering the king, and his father in the past has actually been executed for treason for murdering the king's 9-year-old son. So there's obviously some kind of family history here, and Michael flashes back to sort of the circumstances that led him up to the assassination of the king, or this event that happened. Who knows if he actually did it or not. So yeah, it sounded like a really cool book. It just wasn't really working for me. I will keep it on the shelf. I'm not going to get rid of it, and I will probably give this a try eventually. And if you have been following along with my reading vlogs while I've been in isolation, you probably know what's coming up next. This is Docile by K.M. Spara. This is one that was just a really, really difficult read in a number of ways, and I just couldn't really get into it, unfortunately. Which is funny because it's a super fast-paced read. I know that some people have read this book in 2 sittings. I read about half of it, actually, which is quite a lot for me when I have decided to DNF a book. Usually I'll kind of try to push through because there's something there that is keeping me reading. This book was just, it was a little bit too much for me, and I love my dystopian books. I love my, horrible, capitalism takes over, sci-fi stories. Like, I love Emma Newman's books, but this, I think, with the levels of rape and enslavement and degradation and humiliation, it was just a little bit too much for me, and it wasn't an enjoyable read. I think it's quite a good book if you're looking at kind of like the plot and, the themes and sort of the message that it's trying to portray. I think it's a good book, but for me there was too much rape and enslavement and horribleness that was happening in this, and I'm not someone who will, not read a book that has really difficult themes in it. I love grimdark books, for example. But for me, there has to be a balance of the dark stuff along with stuff that actually makes you want to read the book. And I didn't want to continue reading this book. So Docile follows a young man named Alicia, and he is living in poverty in sort of a very near future in which you inherit your parents' debt, and debt is kind of merged in marriages and whatnot. So his family has $3 million in debt, basically, through various reasons, whether it's things like doctor's appointments or, you know, their grandparents' student debts. All of that stuff accumulates, and they're basically living in poverty and can't get out of it. It's impossible. So he decides to become a docile, which is basically someone who signs a contract with a trillionaire in order to pay off a certain amount of their debt over a certain number of years, and basically becomes their slave. And a contract is signed. There are rules and regulations for being a docile, and there's this drug called docilin, which you can elect to take, which most people do, that basically makes you not remember anything that you are put through during your term as a docile, however long that may be, and also makes you very, very pliant, and you will just obey every single order that your patron gives. So he refuses to take docilin because he's seen the effects that it's had on his mother. She was a docile for 10 years and has never quite recovered from the drug. So he decides that he's not going to take it, which is very much well within his rights, although very unexpected, and he ends up being basically purchased by the man whose family created docilin, and he's currently trying to improve the formula. His name is Alex. So we get both of their points of view. You get Alicia, who is very much like the, very much put upon, enslaved man who's been living in this horrible poverty in a very, very unfair world. And you get Alex's point of view, which was really interesting because he's the trillionaire. He's never known any kind of hardship, even if he doesn't like a lot of the social norms in his world. He very much obeys them because that's just what the world is. He thinks he's a good guy. He's helping this guy get out of $3 million in debt. He's raising up his family. He's doing all this great stuff. He is also using Alicia as a sex slave. And there's so much rape in this book, and there's so much rape from the rapist's point of view, and seeing the juxtaposition between Alicia's reaction afterwards and Alex's reaction afterwards is really fascinating. And that sort of, the balance between the two is really, really interesting, but y'all, it's just too much. There's like orgies, and Alicia is forced to perform oral sex on someone that he doesn't want to, and it is just like they get used literally like horses in a horse race at some point. Like it's hard. It's a really hard book to read. So I thought that I could make it through knowing all of the stuff that happens in this, and I could not, unfortunately. So go in with some warning. There are loads and loads of content warnings and reviews on Goodreads. I'm going to post one at some point. It's not going to be a book for everyone. It wasn't a book for me. That was a really, really long explanation. Okay, so now we're moving on to the books that I did actually finish this month. The first one I have a full review for on this channel, which I will link on the screen. This is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. I talk about this book a lot in that review, so I'm not going to say much here. However, I will say that I was expecting to love it, because Killer Mermaids, like, obviously. Plus, Mira Grant is pen name for Shauna Maguire. I love Shauna Maguire's Wayward Children books. This one didn't do it for me, unfortunately. There were some amazing bits in it, and there were some less amazing bits in it, and ultimately I was very disappointed, even though I did give it 3 stars. So go ahead and check out that review for more. Then I read a sequel to one of my favorite books ever, and the sequel was just as good, if not better, than the first book. This is Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty. City of Brass was my second favorite book of 2018 when I read it, the first being The Poppy War, if you're curious. And I have been putting this off for a really long time. I was worried I wouldn't remember the things that happened in City of Brass. I was worried that maybe it wouldn't live up to my expectations, but as soon as I dove in, I had so much coming back to me, and it's just an amazing, amazing book. Like on page 29, she basically kicks you in the teeth, and I was like, yes. And that pretty much sums up how the rest of the book goes. It's devastating, but it's so good. It's so wonderful. I love these characters. I love this world. Everything about this series is amazing. So I'm obviously not going to talk about what happens in this book, but if you haven't read City of Brass, basically it follows a young woman named Nari who is living on the streets in Cairo. She's been orphaned, she doesn't know who her parents are, and she's kind of a con artist, and she is sort of swindling the people who keep coming and invading and conquering Cairo and occupying Cairo, and she is sort of just living her life desperately wanting to learn how to become a doctor because she has amazing abilities to heal and to sense sickness. So one day she performs what should be kind of a ritual that's not meant to actually do anything. However, she uses this particular language that she has always known her entire life and accidentally summons a djinn. And he takes her to Daevabad, which is the city of brass, the city of the djinn, and it's so good. There's so much politics, there's so much backstabbing, there's some really lovely romance in this, and I just love these books so much. Highly, highly recommended if you have not picked them up. And the last book comes out in June, and I am so excited. Next up is the first of several audiobooks that I listened to this month. This is The Bone Witch by Rin Chapeko. I have been meaning to read this for absolute ages, and I finally decided to break down and listen to the audiobook. And I enjoyed it. I liked it a lot. It's not my favorite book ever, but for someone who has had a lot of trouble with YA fantasy over the past year or so, it was really nice to read a very interesting and intricate YA fantasy book. So we follow Tia, and Tia is a young girl when she discovers her affinity for magic, because many people in her world have some kind of affinity for magic, is necromancy. She is going to be a dark Asha, the Asha being women who are essentially like geishas, who are the ones who perform magic, and they have lots of political power and all of this. And dark Asha basically put down these horrible monsters. So she is sort of swept away by a mentor, and she is going to be trained as an Asha, and hijinks ensue, essentially. My favorite part of this is definitely the world building. The world is absolutely stunning. From the kind of rituals of the Asha, to the clothing, to the food, to how she's being trained, all of that was really fantastic. I also love the Deva, the sort of monsters that these Dark Asha have to put down. I love the fact that the world relies on Dark Asha, however, they have sort of so much superstition around them and people are really, really suspicious. And that was really great. I really loved that. In terms of the characters, Tia's alright. She's very much a YA wonder girl. She's really good at pretty much everything, although she has some stuff that she struggles with. She's basically really good at everything. She's sort of perfect, and I didn't love her, but she was fine for moving the story forward. There are a lot of elements of this book that I did really enjoy that I don't want to talk about because of spoilers, but overall I think it's a nice YA fantasy read. I will continue on with the series. I'm not in a huge rush to do so. I think I'm giving this one about 3.5 to 4 stars. The next book sounded really amazing, but I think that it was maybe slightly misrepresented. So this is The Rearranged Life of Oona Lockhart, and this is by Margarita Montemor. This is being published by Glance. It's out now, it came out in March, and Glance is a strictly sci-fi and fantasy publisher, which is great. That fact made me believe that this book would have a lot more kind of sci-fi elements to it because it's about time travel. However, this is basically a women's fiction book with a very light sci-fi spin, and because of that, it just wasn't for me. I think that people who like women's fiction and are looking for something a little bit different will enjoy this, but if you're a sci-fi fan, probably not. So this book follows a young woman named Oona Lockhart, and I believe it's 1982, New Year's Eve. She is, at a party with her boyfriend, who's the love of her life. They're gonna have this band. She's also trying to make the decision between traveling with this band or going on a study abroad trip to London, and she's about to celebrate her birthday, which is on New Year's Day. And as the clock strikes midnight, Oona passes out and she wakes up and it's 2015 and she is in her 50s. She's no longer 18 years old, she's in her 50s. And this is kind of how her life goes from here on out. She lives a year of her life, and then at midnight, On her birthday, she passes out, wakes up, and it's another year. She could be in her 20s, she could be in her 40s, you know, it doesn't really go in any kind of order. And she's basically trying to correct the mistakes of her life because she realizes as she is aging out of order, she has this interesting perspective, and she has to decide what she can try to do to make her life better. Which is fine. But the time travel basically had no impact on this book other than it was really an excuse for her to be very wealthy because she's basically playing the stock market, having all of this past and future knowledge. And yeah, it really fell flat for me. I think because of my own expectations. I don't think it's the author's fault at all. Yeah, I don't really have a huge amount to say about this one. I wanted to like it. I didn't really like Oona that much. I wasn't hugely interested in her problems in her life. I did like the fact that music is a theme throughout this book, and it's something that ties her to her past. And you know, she loves music. She plays the guitar, she plays the keyboard, she gets music lessons at one point, which is really nice. That's about it. So I gave this one 2.5 out of 5 stars. It's not the author's fault, it's my fault for the expectations that I had, but I do think that this was slightly misrepresented maybe. So when I was reading The Rearranged Life of Oona Lockhart, that's basically when we went into lockdown, and I started exploring my options in terms of books that I wanted to read and books that I was interested in, because this is kind of when I started sort of waffling on a lot of stuff, and I discovered that Scribd was allowing people to sign up for a free 30 days without a credit card, which was very much appreciated, so I decided to join up with Scribd and wanted to check out what they had, because I actually used to subscribe to Scribd when I lived in the States, back when it first started, and it was amazing. And then I moved away to the UK, and the options for what they had on the UK Scribd were just awful. So I haven't even looked at it in years and years, probably since about 2015. And I was really pleased with the number of books that I was actually interested in on Scribd. So I ended up listening to 2 short audiobooks, 2 novellas, the first of which is The Monster of Ellenhaven by Jennifer Giesbrecht, I think. And this is a horror novella. And I really wanted to love this one, but it just wasn't really for me. This seems like it's one that will be really polarizing. I have seen some very, very mixed reviews on Goodreads. It seems like it's something that you either love or you do not. Basically, this book follows a character named Johann, and he is some kind of supernatural monster. He doesn't really know his own origins, and through a series of events ends up in the service of a young man named, what's his name? Florian. Yes, his name's Florian. The fact that I didn't remember that's not great. But basically, Johann is very much kind of what you would imagine as a monster. He murders, he kills, he's a little bit creepy, but Florian also has a devious side. So he's very much kind of this very unassuming young man in sort of the nobility of Ellenhaven, but he has these dark, dark plans. And I feel like this was a really, really good maybe exercise in world building. I really enjoyed the world building of this book. It was interesting. It didn't have a lot to it, but on the surface level it was pretty cool. That's about it. I didn't love the characters. There's a weird kind of power dynamic going on, and there's a weird kind of sexual dynamic going on as well. That didn't really feel particularly consenting, which I had a problem with. It didn't feel like it had a point. The characters didn't really feel like they were doing much, which isn't to say there isn't a plot, but this felt like an unfinished writing exercise, and I feel like it needed an extra like 200 pages in order to really flesh out the story into something that would have been really, really great. So unfortunately, this is one I didn't like. I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. The next novella that I listened to, however, was amazing. I really, really enjoyed it. So this is Upright Women Wanted by Sarah Gailey. I went into this with medium to low expectations because I read Magic for Liars, which was their novel that came out last year, and I didn't love it. I found it kind of underwhelming. So I didn't really know what to expect from this one, but I was curious because of the sort of alternate Wild West theme, and I loved it. I was totally blown away by this book. I thought that it was just fantastic. Upright Women Wanted follows a girl named Esther, and Esther is on the run. She is fleeing from her home because her best friend and lover Beatrice has actually been tried and hung for possessing unlawful material, reading material. And the man that Beatrice was engaged to is now engaged to Esther. Esther does not want this, so Esther flees. And she hides out in the wagon of one of the librarians, who are women that travel what is essentially an alternate version of the Wild West and distribute materials that are approved by the government. And Esther learns that the librarians are a little bit more than meets the eye. So this is a great novella if you are interested in books that have LGBTQ themes. There is a lesbian romance in this book with two side characters, and also Esther has a romance with a non-binary character. And it was really, really wonderful to see all of these people on the page, and I loved the way that it was handled, especially in the way that Sai, who is the non-binary character, has to deal with their sort of gender identity. I loved the world building in this book. I loved the story. I loved the characters. I loved absolutely everything about this. This is easily one of my favorite novellas and is probably going to be a favorite of the year. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. It's absolutely fantastic. And if you get the chance to listen to the audiobook, you really should because the narrator is so good. So at this point in the month, I basically rearranged my bookshelves. I bought 2 new bookshelves and I built them. I vlogged it. You can check it out. I'll put it on the screen. And I put all of my hardbacks in one place. And this was to encourage me to actually pick up some of my hardbacks and read them because I love hardbacks, but it does mean that I spend a lot of money on them and sometimes they tend to sit on the shelf like all of my other books. So I decided to pick up a 2019 release that I was super excited for but never got around to. This is Descendant of the Crane by Joan He. I had kind of middling expectations going into this book because I remember when it came out, I was super, super excited, so I was following a lot of people's reviews, and it did get some mixed reviews. It's a little bit of a slower paced book, and it's got a lot in it. There's a lot of story here, lots of twists and turns, and just sort of everything that was thrown at the page was thrown at the page. However, I really, really enjoyed this one. I have, as I've said a million times, I've already said it in this video, I say it every single video I seem to make, I have not been into YA fantasy for a long time, which is such a shame. There's just something about it that I've had this sort of mental block for. However, I really enjoyed this and I thought it was so much fun and I just really loved it and I'm really hoping we get a sequel at some point. This book follows a young woman named Hesina, and she becomes queen after her father dies. And it is believed that her father dies of natural causes. However, she believes that he was murdered. So she opens up an inquiry into his death and all hell breaks loose. I feel like that kind of covers like a third of what this book is about because the inquiry into her father's death launches 1,000 plot points and there's so many twists and turns in this book. There's a very slow burning romance, there's so much magic and politics and everything gets brought up in this and it was just great. Was it the best written book I've ever read? No, but it was so much fun. I really, really enjoyed it. I had just an absolute blast reading this. I didn't love Hesina as a character. She really just kind of like drives the story forward. However, I really enjoyed the world building. It's absolutely beautiful, beautiful, beautiful world building. I loved a lot of the side characters and I loved the politics and the twists and turns and there's so much stuff that happens in this book that's totally unexpected. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I would highly recommend it, But if you don't like books that are maybe a little bit slower to start, or you don't like books that are just kind of like have, 47 left turns that come out of nowhere, maybe not the one for you. However, I thought this was a great quarantine read. Next up, I have Snow Glass Apples by Neil Gaiman. This was actually gifted to me by my wonderful friend Moon. I have a whole stack of wishlist books that's going to be coming up in my book haul because I participated in a lot of wishlist threads at the beginning of the month to make everyone happy. But she sent me this one, and I'm so glad because I love Neil Gaiman. And while I don't always click with graphic novels, I really enjoyed this one. So as I'm sure you can tell from the title, this is a Snow White retelling, and it is told actually from the perspective of the evil stepmother, the queen. And Snow White doesn't speak in this book. She's really creepy. She's a little bit vampire-y, and it's a really fascinating take on this story. And the artwork is absolutely stunning. It's absolutely beautiful. This is dark, 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 dark. So if you don't like books that have loads of sex and blood and nudity and violence, maybe not the one for you. But if you're looking for a really interesting and really beautiful graphic novel, I definitely recommend this one. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. Then I listened to another audiobook. This is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. I ended up picking up the audiobook for this because I was searching for more books by the narrator who did The Bone Witch because I thought she was really good. Turned out that she narrated this one. I've had this sat on my shelf since it came out. I've been meaning to read it for ages because this cover is amazing and it sounded like so much fun, and it was. I loved this, and it was my very first Grady Hendrix book. This book follows two girls named Abby and Gretchen, and they have been best friends since the 4th grade, and they are completely inseparable. And by the time they get to high school, they have a small group of friends. There are 4 of them. And one night they go skinny dipping, and something goes horribly wrong, and Gretchen does not come back the same person. So after this incident, she starts acting very strange. She's moody. She's neglecting her hygiene. She's acting very, very weirdly, and Abby is very suspicious that something has happened. However, it's not quite what she thinks. I really enjoyed this. So this is super 80s-tastic, which makes me so, so happy. And if you like things like Stranger Things that very much have that sort of throwback nostalgia for the 80s that are by someone who experienced the 80s, I think you'll really enjoy this one. This is a straight-up horror novel, but it also deals with a lot of other aspects of life. So Gretchen is a member of a family that is very, very wealthy. Abby is a member of a family that is very poor. Gretchen's family is super right-wing, super religious, and Abby and Gretchen are not that way. And it's just a really, really fun exploration of friendship, of female friendship, growing up in this really interesting time, and also demons. So I loved this. This is super fun. It does have a lot of stuff in it that I think is very fitting for the time period. The 1980s were not quite as politically correct as we are today. And there's a lot of things like victim blaming. At one point, there's talk of rape, a potential rape that may have happened, a lot of stuff like that. So maybe pick this one up with some caution if that's not something you're interested in. However, it was so fun. I really, really enjoyed this book. It was just a delight. It was really fun, and the audiobook is very good as well. Next up was another audiobook, my last audiobook of the month. It was another Scribd audiobook like The Monster of Eldenhaven and Upright Women Wanted. This is The Light Brigade by Cameron Hurley. I have been sort of following her on social media for a very, very long time, but I've never read any of her books. And when I had the opportunity to request a copy of this book from the publisher, which I'll go into in my book haul, I was all over it. And because I had a physical copy of it and I spotted it on Scribd for the audiobook, I decided to pick it up, and I'm really glad that I did because the audio is fantastic and the story is amazing. The Light Brigade is kind of what I wanted Starship Troopers to be. I hated Starship Troopers, but I love the concept of watching this character kind of go up through the military ranks, through their career, and sort of what happens to them, how they react to the war that they're fighting. And that was not Starship Troopers, but that is very much what this is. I really loved it. It's got all the good bits of Starship Troopers expanded and made better, which is awesome. If you've read Starship Troopers and you feel the same way as me, like, definitely pick this book up. But basically we follow a character named Dietz, and Dietz is basically a military grunt. They start sort of at the lowest level of society as what's called a ghoul, basically a person who's not a resident, not a citizen, and who lives in kind of like these horrible labor camps. And eventually her parents work their way up to becoming residents, and she decides that she's going to enter into the military. So we follow her career, and we also start to see that things are not quite right. Something is happening to Dietz, and it seems like she has gaps in her memory. She's going on these drops to fight in battles, and she, you know, will be in the wrong battle, not the place that she's meant to go. And we start to unravel what's going on here. And what makes this really interesting is the way that they are performing these military drops, the way that they are sort of cheating the speed of light by breaking up soldiers basically into particles of light and shooting them off towards Mars, who they're at war with. And I loved this. I thought that this was great. It is very hard sci-fi. It's definitely military sci-fi. If that's not your thing, you're not gonna like this. But if you enjoy those kinds of books, you should absolutely pick this up. I am fully ready to dive into whatever Cameron Hurley book I can next. I think I have The Stars Are Legion on my shelf, and I'm so pumped. I am already a big fan of hers based on this one book. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. And last but not least, I read The Queen of Crows by Mike Cole, which is the very shiny sequel to The Armored Saint. So this is the second book in the Sacred Throne trilogy, and I have the third on my shelf as well. I figured that this was the perfect time to actually finish off this series because I really, really enjoyed the first book, and based on how much I enjoyed the first book, I bought the rest of them. So it's high time I picked this up. This one is funny because in a lot of ways, it's a very different book from the first one. However, that's not a bad thing. I feel like in a lot of ways, this story has grown so much, and while they're very much still, you know, connected and it feels like a very logical sequel, it's a very different book. So in the first book, we focus on this character named Eloise, who is a villager in this kind of tiny, impoverished village, and they basically accidentally incur the wrath of the Order, who are essentially the people who go out and enforce the religion of this world. There are no wizards who are allowed to live because they create these horrible sort of demonic creatures, and they sort of use horrible, horrible violence and brutality to maintain order. So her village sort of gets caught up in this conflict with the Order, and Eloise is right in the middle of it. I don't want to spoil anything for the second book or how that first book ends, but this one carries on. And whereas I feel like the first book really focuses on her as a character and her development and her sort of trying to figure out what is right and what is wrong. She is a gay woman, and it's a very, very religious place. That's not okay. That's not allowed. Everything's really complicated. That book really focuses on her. This one focuses much more on sort of the village as a whole, the people who are around her, and sort of the reaction to the first book. So I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I think I gave the first one 4.5, just because I really liked that element of sort of figuring out who this character was. And I cannot wait to read the third book, which I'll probably try to pick up in April, maybe in May, we'll see. But I really enjoyed this series. I'm very, very excited to finish it up and read something else by him too. So that is it for the month of March. It was a weird one for all of us, I'm sure. I would love to know what you guys read in March. I want to know how you're doing. Are you someone who's stuck in quarantine? Are you working from home? Are you an essential worker? I'd love to chat and sort of feel like we're still connecting with each other. I haven't seen another human being that is not my husband in like 2 weeks. So let's talk. Let's chat. I would really love to hear how you're doing, what books you've been reading, what you read in March, if you've read any of these, or if you picked up anything really cool. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.